Bode Morin, Director of the Anthracite Heritage Museum in XXII Village of the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission. I want to thank Miguel for inviting me to join you today. The title of my paper, Landscapes of Compromise, Towards a Sustainable Framework for Mining and Industrial Heritage. Sustainability can take many directions in heritage, but in its basic form, sustainability requires providing equal or greater value than costs, however defined, to meet current needs and ensure the continued access and conservation of that heritage for future generations. Value can be defined in terms of economics, which is often the case, but it can also include history, identity, memory, aesthetics, resource conservation, and access. Costs can be defined in economic, historical, identity, and memory terms as well, but also include health, environmental factors, and accessibility. Often the very highest forms of conservation are not suitable for a variety of reasons, and compromises to reach sustainability are necessary. Industrial heritage significance is enhanced with the longevity of activity, but that longevity often creates major issues with environmental damage and environmental change. In the United States, as with many other countries, we have federal laws that both promote cleanup of significant environmental damage and also promote and protect heritage. And where both cleanup is necessary and heritage is significant enough, compromises are made to fulfill both mandates to reach some sort of sustainability as defined by the continued access and conservation of heritage sites. This paper will examine copper mining sites in Montana and anthracite coal mining sites in Pennsylvania that have had a long history of production that led to the need for significant cleanup but are now functioning as heritage sites. In a perfect setting, how do we define ideal heritage? Is it a completely preserved structure in its original setting? Does it include people? What about value, identity, and memories? Can tangible heritage truly exist without intangible heritage? Of course, the success of heritage hinges on many things, and ideal heritage must meet community values with meaningful conservation, management, and access. An important feature of ideal heritage is, of course, sustainability. Sustainable heritage must manage current needs to ensure long-term accessibility and conservation to guarantee that future generations can apply their values, and it must overcome contemporary site problems that may impact future uses. Compromises, however, are generally not intended to favor one site disproportionately, but we don't always get the best heritage plan. But we do get better options for future sustainability. Industrial heritage, unlike, say, house museums or military installations, can encompass huge landscapes. Sometimes, significant industrial heritage owes part of its significance to longevity. Longevity and scale enhance significance, but also pose potential problems for long-term sustainability. Some of those long-term sites, especially starting in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, had such a scale of operations that they generated considerable industrial waste, that while an important component of significance can, in certain instances, corrupt sustainability. Not all significant industrial sites were generally bad polluters. Places like the Butte plant in Detroit or Slater Mill in Rhode Island, and sites associated with worker housing like XXII Village, or those that existed on a small scale, did not generate the volumes of environmental waste that required a significant intervention. But many sites, including some of the largest manufacturing plants or longest-run mining operations, did. Even small-scale waste generators in these situations can be magnified over a century. And much of the significance of these places is tied up with their longevity and their scale of operations. Taking into account that copper mines, for example, can effectively process ores down to 0.05% rich, means that 99.5% of the ore they bring up from the ground is waste. In fact, metalworks pollution has been documented as far back as the Roman times, and smelter smoke lawsuits have been argued for centuries. Further exacerbating the situation is that there have been few laws or rules for the disposition of waste beyond nuisance laws. The early 20th century notion of conservation in mining was even tied solely to managing the resources and nothing about long-term waste disposal for the environment. Let me also say that not all waste should or needs to be remediated. In fact, unless there is impending harm to human health or the environment, and hence sustainability, it is in the best interest of those sites to preserve those waste streams as significant contributors to a heritage landscape. But in those places where threats to human health and the environment exist, sustainability cannot be reached. Through the 19th and 20th centuries, the United States had years of expanding industrial production. American output affected 2 world wars, changed the structure of global wealth, firmly established the middle class, and by and large created the consumer economy. Much of this was done over a period with little regard for the non-commercial byproducts of production. Factories dumped wastewater into rivers and oceans, vented caustic gases into the atmosphere, and allowed chemical waste to seep into soils and groundwater. Mines and smelter sites, often in sparsely populated areas, simply left their waste tailings and slag wherever they could, and usually only considered them again if they interfered with production. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that people in the United States began to question the lasting effects of industrial activity on the landscape, especially as environmental disasters seemed preventable, and studies demonstrating the effects of long-term exposure to more invisible toxins became more alarming. Beginning in the 1940s, Congress passed laws regulating the output and transportation of hazardous substances, and in 1970 created the Environmental Protection Agency, whose mission was simply to protect human health and the environment by establishing pollution standards, monitoring industrial effluent, and prosecuting pollution violators. The 1942 Water Pollution Control Act, the Air Pollution Act of 1955, the 1970 Clean Air Act, and 1972 Clean Water Act went a long way to curb current and future pollution by setting limits to discharges and establishing penalties. The Resource Recovery Act of 1976 established rules for the transportation and disposal of hazardous waste, and the 1977 Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act defined how mine sites will be managed when they are done mining. While all of these acts had implications for current and future pollution, they did little to remediate the persistent effects of past pollution and existing hazardous waste deposits. That all changed in 1980. In the 1970s, members of a housing development in New York discovered a significant deposit of industrial waste buried below a residential district and school. For decades, that community had been experiencing much higher incidence of nervous system disorders, birth and early childhood complications, and blood diseases stemming from groundwater impacted by concentrated industrial deposits. In 1980, Congress passed the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, more commonly referred to as Superfund, to identify significant sites of past pollution, categorize them on a national priority list, and plan for and execute the remediation of those sites. Further, if the original polluter or some later party was still economically viable and a legal entity, then the EPA, which administers Superfund, will label them a potentially responsible party and attempt to force them to manage the cleanup or seek to recoup the cost of the cleanup. In those instances where a perp could not be identified, CERCLA provided public money, the Superfund, raised some chemical and petroleum industry taxes to pay for the remediation of any significant polluted sites. While some of the 1,300 sites listed on the national priorities list are military bases, warehouses, or transportation sites, the majority of them were listed because of long-term industrial activity. But because of this longevity, many of these places also hold significance to American economic, social, and industrial history. While environmental laws have been a relatively recent phenomenon, formal heritage laws in the U.S. date back to the early 20th century. Over a 150-year period, the United States developed a system to identify, document, preserve, and interpret structures and landscapes of regional and national significance. The U.S. Antiquities Act of 1906 first permitted the official designation of National Historic Landmarks and created penalties for harm caused to federally owned cultural resources. 60 years later, the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 expanded the National Register of Historic Places, created and assigned duties to the state historic preservation offices, and established rules for managing historic resources on federal property. A key component of the National Historic Preservation Act is Section 106, which requires that all undertakings or projects executed with federal funds or requiring federal permits consider and mitigate the potential damage to cultural resources worthy of inclusion on the National Register, including federalized environmental remediation efforts like Superfund. The National Historic Preservation Act requires state historic preservation officers to determine the National Register eligibility of potentially impacted cultural resources and approve mitigation efforts. This law requires consideration of impacts by federal projects to all heritage as defined by National Register criteria. Many long-standing industrial sites therefore have dichotomous legacies. On one hand, they hold significance to American history and mark important economic, social, and technological development, and as such are important heritage sites. On the other hand, they are responsible for many of the most egregious pollution releases, requiring extensive cleanups and incurring considerable cost. Federal laws articulated by the National Historic Preservation Act and Superfund exists to protect and correct both legacies for the betterment of the public. Superfund, despite its specific health relevance to contaminated communities, is not exempt from the provisions of Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, and as such, the EPA is required to protect historic resources and encounters. Of course, values play an important role in determining significance in the battle over remediation and preservation. To meet the first level of sustainability, we need to manage the approach to cleanup to ensure that significant heritage sites meet basic standards for public safety and stabilization, to therefore ensure future accessibility. We need to find that compromise between environment and heritage to reach that sustainability. Therefore, some of the largest industrial landscapes in the country, mining landscapes of a certain age, often encompass both high degrees of heritage significance and considerable levels of pollution. The Butte Anaconda, Montana Copper District encompassed both the largest productive copper district in the world for a period of time and became the largest Superfund project. Butte Anaconda is a key industrial heritage landscape in this country and also one of the most polluted landscapes in the country. Among its notable heritage is one of the longest-run copper mine and smelter complexes in the U.S. At one time, it was the largest smelter complex in the world. It was the largest copper company in the world, and it created a political system to control state government and all media in the state. But this heritage, this longevity, coupled with a significant deposit of sulfide ore, led to a critical pollution problem. In fact, the company that began in the 1880s was only starting to slow down about the time the U.S. was considering the impacts of waste disposal on the landscape. The timing of both the shutdown of mining operations and smelter operations was curiously close to the implementation of new and stricter pollution laws. As you can see, the extensive operation and time frame led to considerable issues with heavy metals, phosphates, sulfides, smelter waste, and other tailings spread over hundreds of miles, impacting cities, farms, and open federal land. The challenge for heritage proponents is negotiating for conservation of significant heritage amid a heavily funded cleanup, with cleanup professionals not necessarily sharing the same values and not fully appreciating the nuances of preservation law. This conflict ultimately leads to a compromised landscape that, while ostensibly remediated, did leave some heritage on the landscape. Cleanup efforts in Butte Anaconda began in the 1980s and eventually included cultural resource assessments as required by the National Historic Preservation Act. Ultimately, the values for significant heritage varied considerably, and even though some of the $1 billion spent on remediation was dedicated to preservation efforts, many significant structures were lost. While not all was lost, not enough remained to demonstrate outstanding universal value. On a smaller regional scale, the Anthracite Heritage Museum and Lackawanna Mine Tour were developed by state and county officials at a former mining location undergoing remediation. In Pennsylvania, the anthracite coal industry provided the first significant change to energy production for the young United States. Starting in the 18th century, the industry peaked in 1917, and while giving way to alternate fossil fuels like bituminous coal, oil, and natural gas, anthracite is still mined and processed today. Pennsylvania anthracite deposits covered 484 square miles in 11 counties. That's 125,000 hectares. Over its history, it operated thousands of locations and employed millions of workers. Many of the early mining was done underground, and much of the later mining was done on the surface. With such a long history, the industry left a considerably altered landscape. Efforts have been made to preserve some of the key landscape features, while other locations have undergone some sort of remediation to turn the places to safe and more productive land use, often parks, landfills, or warehouse complexes. Because of the broad disparity of values in relic industrial landscapes, oftentimes it proves challenging to articulate the importance of heritage preservation, especially when a large population exists that has suffered through significant economic crisis. And while many times we don't achieve the goals we wish for and compromises fall short, that's not true all the time. The Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, the Federal Office of Surface Mining, and the EPA have worked to identify properties that pose significant threats to human activity and work to remediate those landscapes while not completely disregarding heritage. While some locations have minimal heritage components or considerations, others have important remains intact. That said, a key remediation project in Scranton, Pennsylvania, took an abandoned mining landscape and created a public park out of the space. While the majority of the park appears to deny the site's history, the project did preserve one underground mine entrance and converted it into a tourist mine, and created the Anthracite Heritage Museum. This mine site had two key eras historically, one in the 1850s and the other in the 1950s. It was not a significant producer, but its location was very close to population centers. Part of the impetus for this project was in reaction to the energy crisis of the 1970s and the expectation that U.S. coal would regain its energy prominence to offset the loss of access to global oil supplies. This project presumed there would be an increase in the number of new surface mines, which would later require some sort of remediation. As you can see, the site had fairly extensive surface pits and a functioning underground mine. So unlike the Butte Anaconda district, this remediation project began with a heritage component included. Fortunately, some of the waste tips remain on the landscape. They are largely hidden and off limits to the public. And outside of the museum and mine tour, the park looks pretty much like any other recreation-only landscape. Not all planning decisions are easy, and currently arguing for heritage has become even more difficult. But there are necessary compromises required to reach some form of sustainability and ensure that we don't completely lose our heritage and that future generations have an opportunity to engage the sites we preserve. We won't always reach ideal heritage, but as we all know, reaching some form of lasting preservation has its values too, and we need to start by overcoming obstacles to sustainability, especially environmental threats. Gracias, and thank you.